U.S. President Donald Trump is paying his first state visit to China from November 8th to 10th, which is being called a State Visit Plus by China. How will his arrival influence the development of China-U.S. relations? In April at Mar-a-Lago, Presidents Xi and Trump agreed on a 100-day action plan in economic cooperation and the launching of 4 areas of dialogue. What significant outcomes can we expect this time for the world's 2 largest economies? Trump exerted further pressure on the DPRK during his state visits to Japan and South Korea, while China continues to call on all sides to reduce tension and bring the nuclear issue back on track through dialogue. How can the 2 countries better collaborate on the nuclear issue? While China has been a staunch supporter of globalization, the U.S. has pulled back from multilateral international frameworks such as the TPP, the Paris Climate Agreement and UNESCO. Is multilateralism in retreat? What role can China play?
China has rolled out the red carpet for U.S. President Donald Trump. His visit comes at a time when discussions about global leadership by China and a new world order are generating headlines in many parts of the world. And U.S. allies in the region are watching with caution for a renewed U.S.-Asia policy as tensions continue on the Korean Peninsula. How will the 2 leaders address the DPRK headache? Will Trump present a clear and coherent statement of the U.S. commitment to the region or a more uncertain assessment? And will Trump's China visit replicate the good chemistry of the Mar-a-Lago summit? To discuss these issues and more, today I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Su Ge, President of the China Institute of International Studies, and Professor James Ray from California State University, Sacramento. We shall also talk to Richard Waits, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. China describes the first visit by President Trump to East Asia as a state visit plus, particularly to China. What does the Chinese government mean, actually?
Well, state visit plus, that actually is a very good and accurate term to describe the visit. Just imagine, just think of the timing of the stage, who is coming, who's going to have talks with whom. And the world's largest 2 economies, the heads of the states are coming to meet in Beijing. So what type of kind of signal are they going to send out? So lots of countries and lots of people are waiting and watching. In our opinion, when the bilateral relations do not just mean something for the 2 countries, for the 2 peoples, it means something for the whole region and even for the world, peace, stability, and growth. Yes, in China, and China just concluded the 19th Party Congress, in which President Xi Jinping is reconfirmed as the core of party leadership. And the conference has determined on something magnificent for the next few decades of economic growth, of continued political stability and social improvement. Against this period, and China would describe a new era, I think that we have lots to expect for both leaders to have cooperation and to set up to work out the future direction in which the bilateral relations is going to move into.
There's no question about how important a constructive and healthy bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing would be for the rest of the world. Having said this, let me go back to the issue on State Visit Plus. In the broad context of the Mar-a-Lago summit in Florida, does the plus actually mean building up or construction of a personal chemistry other than the state visit? Because the late senior leader Deng Xiaoping said his relationship with Bush Sr. was very good, despite what happened in 1989 in China. So how important is the chemistry between the heads of state in this context?
I think it's very important, and I think particularly American presidents who don't have a lot of foreign policy experience become very enamored with the idea of building friendships across countries that might not have the same shared viewpoints on contextual issues. And I think somebody like Donald Trump is particularly sensitive and needs that kind of attention and will be very wowed by the sort of state visit plus treatment. And I think it could even have some impact on his attitude, because we know from the previous meeting at Mar-a-Lago that sort of transformed, I think, President Trump's view of the relationship to China, not just President Xi. And so it could have potential positive impact for, I think, China's foreign policy interests and sort of cultivating a relationship, because ultimately Trump's advisors have a strategic point of view, but President Trump will make these decisions, and if he has a good rapport with President Xi, as they seem to, and of course the U.S. Ambassador Branstad has a good rapport with President Xi, I think that will lead to a positive outcome in this meeting.
One more question about the chemistry, or personal chemistry, between leaders of the two superpowers. Let me go back to Japan. The first leg of the presidential trip to East Asia. He played golf with the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The two guys seem to be pretty friendly and very easy with each other. In sharp contrast with the easy way of playing golf in Japan, President Xi Jinping and his wife received the American first couple in the Forbidden City, which would immediately take people, particularly Americans, back to centuries ago, where China used to be a big empire. We contributed to 2/3 of the world's GDP for 18 centuries out of 20. That's what Governor Chris Patton said in an exclusive interview with me at least 1 decade and a half ago. So what do you think of the place of a Forbidden City? Does that make a big difference in terms of building personal chemistry?
Well, I would think so, depending just from which angle you look at it, because China is known as a bold civilization. When you come to Japan, because Abe was trying just to find something to please, to suit into Abe's habits, they are going to play the golf. For China, naturally you will choose some place with historical significance. I think Forbidden City is a natural choice. And not only the place where the emperors used to live, you see the architecture, but they are going to be introduced in a place it's known as the treasure house. And now it's the museum of there is an exhibition of the history of the museum. And that's the place where they restore very old relics. So there, first hand, and Trump is going to be introduced by President Xi Jinping and the Chinese First Lady to the scenes how these precious relics, broken the pieces, are restored. And finally, they are going to, there is a little theater and half open, and last time it was used, that was during the Qing dynasty. This time they are going to try a few items there. I think this shows that China is known as a country and the people are known as a people for hospitality. Because last time when President Xi Jinping and Madame Peng Liyuan were in Florida, they were treated very nicely, and this time, I think the same cordial reception will be extended.
Right. The first couple from the United States were invited to watch a Peking opera played by kids. Yeah. And while President Xi Jinping invited President Trump to have tea there, yeah. Pretty relaxed, by the way. Let me go to Richard White, a senior fellow of Hudson Institute, for his thoughts on the ongoing official visit by President Trump to China, the first of its kind. Hi, Richard, what's your take on the narrative that the U.S. leadership on the global stage and in Asia is receding? Is China about to replace the U.S. as the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific?
We've heard variants of this narrative for the past decade, and it was a particular concern about 10 years ago when the U.S. was so focused on the wars in the Middle East and was not really doing much about Korea, But I think in the last, since then, the last 10 years, we've seen a resurgence of U.S. interests in Asia-Pacific. There was the Obama administration's Asia pivot. When Trump was elected, there was uncertainty over whether he would pursue an isolationist foreign policy in general. But we haven't seen that. And in the Asia-Pacific region, if anything, so far, we've seen a very strong continuity, a lot of U.S. military operations, presidential visits, and so on. And China, the long-term variables are very favorable to further increase its power and influence. But whether it would replace the U.S. entirely, I don't know. I think it's more likely we'll see this continue sort of duopoly in which you have China and the U.S. as the strongest powers. But there are important middle players that serve to buffer that. There's Japan, India, potentially Russia, and the ASEAN countries. So I don't see that narrative taking hold anytime soon.
Well, perhaps it's a nasty expression to use the Cold War wording like a sphere of influence to be established between the two superpowers in, 20 years from now or 15 years. So do you think what we have in terms of the geopolitical scenario in much of East Asia is the co-evolution of the two major powers, with the United States protecting not only its allies but major business partners, the security umbrella, with China providing sustainable investment and free trade. So what do you think of the dual-track mechanism to be shared by the United States and China, and this would be a peaceful trajectory?
I think that's a more plausible scenario in which China and the United States have very powerful militaries and therefore would discourage the other from acting unilaterally in particular cases. Whereas economically, although there's friction between the countries, they are their two most important economic partners. And they complement each other well in some respects. China, as you know, has this very ambitious One Belt, One Road initiative, which is going to, if it succeeds, will bring a lot of needed infrastructure to the region, will help with the integration, will strengthen many of the regional economies. And the United States has strengths in various sectors: high technology, small entrepreneurship, female entrepreneurship. So I think that scenario, to me, sounds much more plausible, the first one. You'll see a mixed cooperative competitive relationship, but certainly no direct conflict and lots of win-win situations for people in the other countries.
Many Americans are concerned that President Trump doesn't have a clear strategy about Asia or China. Instead, he relies on the personal chemistry with his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Xi Jinping. Having said this, even during the Obama administration, Richard, Republicans and Democrats have been trying to reassess the bilateral relationship, the most consequential one in the 21st century. Now, do you think the two sides across the aisle have been able to reach a consensus after years of reassessment about the growing Chinese influence in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, it's a good question. When he ran for election as president, Donald Trump made statements that suggested he was going to break from the bipartisan consensus, which pretty much had been, as you described, that there's a general need to cooperate with China, even as we differ on certain areas, Korea, freedom of navigation, and so on. He seemed in his election campaign to make a much more stronger stance. Some of his advisors said, well, we need to align with India and Russia against China as the long-term challenger. But since he's been elected, and in particular since his meeting with President Xi, as he said, they had very good personal chemistry when they met here in Florida, he's backed off from that. He's made statements that he, at times, come back to that kind of competitive rhetoric on trade, for example. But for the most part, he's tried to work very closely with China to deal with the Korea situation. And certainly the leaders he's going to meet in Asia are going to try and encourage the United States not to back down from China, not to be isolationist, but certainly they don't want to see a confrontation with China. And so you'll have, I think we described that second scenario in which there'll be some competition but a lot of cooperation, which is a pretty good scenario compared to, say, what you have in Europe or some of the other, or the Middle East, where there's much more either clear bipolar divisions, or in the Middle East just much more outright conflict.
Richard, the last question is about the issue of trade protectionism and his administration. For example, China enjoys a considerable trade surplus with the United States. During the Obama administration, anti-dumping and anti-subsidy investigations were launched against China using a third country as a gauge for the alleged dumping of or export of overcapacity. Now, in what ways or in what areas do you think President Trump is likely to take punitive measures against China to create more jobs and to lure more of the American multinationals back to your country?
Well, the administration has launched a review of this very issue, and so we don't quite know what their policy is. We just know that there will be a policy, and this is considered an important issue. And you've seen President Trump in Japan, and I think you'll see this in the other countries, make statements discussing the importance of equalizing trade relations, increasing opportunities for U.S. businesses. So it's not only China, it's this general foreign policy outlook of wanting to improve the U.S. economic situation.
Thank you, Richard, for briefing us with your insightful analysis on so many interesting and critically important issues about the relationship between Washington and Beijing. Welcome back, James. Let's look at the trade issues. Do you believe China would come under huge pressure despite the alleged 100-day plan? And I wonder if that ambitious initiative put forward by President Xi Jinping has really paid off, and to what degree do you think the American media, the D.C., and President Trump himself are satisfied with the 100-day plan?
I would not be surprised if after he left, President Trump makes some commentary about the trade deficit. I think he's very focused, even with Korea and Japan, on trade deficits, and it's somewhat of an antiquated way of thinking, because ultimately many of those products made in China are American companies who are just sending products back to the U.S. So I don't think it's an issue that will go very far. It's been a long-term issue that Trump has kind of grabbed onto, but I don't see it being too sensitive.
Ambassador Su, what should be done to reduce the trade deficit? I mean, for example, China insists that more high-tech transfers should be conducted from the U.S. side instead of citing national security as the reason to bar merger and acquisition of some of the high-tech firms in the United States. We've always been facing this kind of administrative interventions or from a lawmaking body such as the U.S. Congress. What do you think of our frustrations?
I think that on the general analysis is that the trade between the United States and China are complementary to each other. China is large. China buys 1/4 of Boeing airplanes. China buys 56% of soybeans, and China is the ensemble of putting together parts produced elsewhere, but the United States remains the leading edge of cell phones, for instance. China put them together.
And so what we do is pretty low value added part of the assembly line. The United States gains most of the high profits.
Yeah, in the end, the Chinese ensemble line only makes about 5% of the total profits, but U.S. reaps the larger part. So I think that the best way is to come down to solve the issue through talks and negotiations. To just unilaterally just raising the tariffs and threaten to carry out some drastic measures, and then you find retaliation. So trade wars is no solution. So this time, and I think that United States, we hope that they will loosen some of the trade restrictions. So there is, I read in the paper saying that if the United States had to lower some of the restrictions and give China the same equal status with Brazil, and the trade volume would increase 24%.
I'm afraid the topping the agenda of President Trump's visit here to China in particular is the DPRK. Look at the concentration of American military hardware, the aircraft carrier strike groups here, unprecedented. War clouds are gathering, as I said earlier in the opening remarks. Now, Just on the eve of President Trump's visit, rapprochement has been achieved between ROK and the PRC on the issue of THAAD deployment. China seems to have relaxed our embargo, quote unquote, against the South Korean economy. After Seoul promised, for example, it would not join the US-led missile defense program, it would not be part of the trilateral treaty defense or alliance between the United States, Japan, and South Korea. It will not deploy any more batteries of THAAD. So what do you think of the three no's?
Well, I feel like this is the most frustrated China has been with the DPRK in my memory, and so I think that serves to cement the U.S.-China view of stopping the ballistic missile test, the nuclear weapons program. And so if China really has good relations with all parties in the six-party talks, and I think Trump's sort of escalating rhetoric of retaliatory measures doesn't benefit the situation. But so I think China is essentially doing all it can. It's joined the sanctions. It's putting the kind of pressure the U.S. wants. And so I'm hopeful that that won't be too sensitive of an issue as well.
The formidable nuclear arsenal, well, perhaps I should rephrase my question. The nuclear deterrence, if any, by the DPRK has paid off in alerting the world to the very issue of nuclearization. However, do you think the United States' deterrence of having such a big, enormous concentration of the military in Northeast Asia has paid off, since the DPRK remains pretty quiet these days without conducting any more missile or nuclear tests during this very important period of President Trump's visit here? What do you think of the quietness from Pyongyang?
Well, when you look at the situation, the situation in in the Korean Peninsula is very intense and fragile. But you are right. In the last few weeks, Pyongyang has been fairly quiet.
For 2 months.
Yeah,
the DPRK remains pretty quiet.
So I think that now when you look at what the Chinese foreign minister has to offer, that what about a moratorium for moratorium? That is suspension for suspension. What about you exercise, U.S. and South Korea, you consider suspend the military exercises in exchange for the North Korean suspension of the nuclear drills. In this way, in addition to the outside pressure following out the United Nations Security Council resolution, we hope that all these parties concerned will be able to find a window of opportunity for real talks, be it three-party talks, five-party talks, or better still, six-party talks.
Many observers would agree that Taiwan is not prioritized on the agenda of President Trump this time. However, recently, the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee passed the Taiwan Travel Act, which calls for the complete lifting of restrictions on high-level visits between the United States and Taiwan. Will President Trump ever give the green light to that act, and what does that mean for the bilateral relationship?
Well, there's always that kind of neoconservative bloc in the U.S. Congress, primarily in the Republican Party, that pushes for full support to Taiwan. And every president, even George W. Bush, who had neoconservatives in administration, was very harsh with former leaders in Taiwan. So I don't anticipate Trump would break that consensus that was built back in the 1970s. But there is always with President Trump some concern based on the phone call that he took early on, how committed he is. But I think this relationship with President Xi has sort of made him realize the true importance of the U.S.-PRC relationship.
Indeed, the one China policy, one China principle will serve as the bedrock of the bilateral relationship between U.S. and China. I hope that, and I certainly believe that in the future, if we both sides carefully handle the Taiwan issue, and then both sides will be able to find a prospect in which both countries have more cooperation with each other.
While no one has a clear idea as to whether President Trump and his Chinese counterpart will meet again on the sidelines of the upcoming APEC conference in Vietnam, what do you think of the issue of South China Sea? What do you think of the quiet waters there? Do you think you expect a more innocent passage, quote-unquote, by American military vessels?
Well, based on the rhetoric of an Indo-Pacific region and the U.S. sort of luring India's naval capacity more toward Southeast Asia, even trying to bring more parties into the South China Sea, and I think that raises some concern. I think President Trump himself is more focused on the economic relationship and doesn't himself see the security posture of inserting American aircraft carriers into the region as central. So I think that's still very much up in the air, and I think will continue to be an issue, but I hope it will fade.
Ambassador Su, are you convinced that the majority of the member states of ASEAN and other economies in the Asia-Pacific region are coming to terms with the fact that they have to take sides between two economic giants or military superpower, the United States and the PRC, depending on the issues and circumstances? Do you think this will be more of an adverse circumstance for all players in the region? My God, China's influence is growing so rapidly, economically and militarily in this region, but the United States remains the superpower in the foreseeable future. What does that mean for the small and medium-sized countries?
In the ASEAN? Well, let me just quote something from a friend in Singapore. Once, when I was a student, I chatted with him. He said, well, we are a small nation, and we are afraid to be caught between two warring states. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you see two big elephants fighting with each other, and that would be very dangerous for any smaller animals standing by. I think that for good news for them is that the U.S. and China, I think we are going to come to terms with each other. We are going to have a cooperative relationship. Another is that China is going to follow a peaceful foreign policy of peace and development, and we have the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. So Chinese foreign relations and the general relations with ASEAN countries is in the very good stage. And for the days to come, we expect very good relations between China and ASEAN.
That's a pretty encouraging picture. But James, what do you think of the wording, the novel wording of Indo-Pacific region? It's different from back to Asia. Is that a deliberate attempt by the Trump administration to keep a distance from the Obama line on Asia?
I think it's very significant. In fact, I would say the U.S. has particularly emphasized Asia-Pacific just to link Pacific to bring the United States and even Latin America in with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and APEC and so forth. And otherwise, we would look at East Asia. The East Asian Summit is what President Trump is skipping, and that really centers China as the tributary head in the past and the center of civilization in the region. And then to bring Indian Ocean just makes it a maritime conception, but if we're talking about India is part of Asia. It's already part of Asia-Pacific. So I think it's a very provocative change of terminology, and really one that is designed to suggest China is not going to play the center and that India will be a partner in sort of a strategic relationship with the U.S.
Well, perhaps we have exaggerated the ambition of the Trump administration in building a new concept concerning this broad region of the Asia-Pacific region. India may have played a critical role in reshaping the vision of the Trump administration. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on the ongoing official visit by President Trump to China, the first of its kind since he took office 1 year ago. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time here. Until then, goodbye.